We are pleased and honored to have Michael Chertoff with us tonight. My name is John Wilson, and I am a trustee of the World Affairs Council. Please join me in welcoming Michael Chertoff.
In a world of networked interdependence, where the failure of one part of the network can have huge effects on other people's property and other people's lives, the market doesn't always adequately reflect the costs involved of failing to invest in security. So again, the market and the normal market incentives may simply be insufficient to reflect the challenge if critical national infrastructure is subject to a cyber attack. Now, some people say this whole thing is overblown and it's not a real threat. And I can tell you, if you've read the news in the last couple of years, you've heard about sophisticated attacks against Google, a sophisticated attack against RSA, which itself is a security company, attacks against financial institutions, including the NASDAQ, which was reported in the Wall Street Journal, attacks against defense contractors. In the last couple of months, the U.S. government published a fairly unusual document from the National Counterintelligence Executive. And that document talked about the fact that in China and in Russia, there are groups that are deliberately and systematically focusing on our intellectual property and our business companies in order to extract and make use of critical intellectual property. So this is not a matter of a theoretical possibility or a threat that hasn't happened yet. It is a matter of things that are actually going on now with a real economic impact. Beyond that, there are, I'm sometimes asked, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And the worst thing that could happen would be to go beyond the theft of intellectual property and actually to have damage or destruction of our critical national infrastructure systems. Again, not a theoretical possibility, but something that's happened in the past. In 2007, when there was a political conflict between Estonia and Russia, so-called Russian hacktivists made a concerted effort over a period of days to mount very substantial denial of service attacks to basically take down the Estonian government and financial system. And actually, the U.S. government helped the Estonian government respond to that and mitigate the damage. There's still a debate about who was responsible for that. The Russian government disavowed this as being an official policy. But of course, one of the challenges in this area is it's often difficult to prove whether a government is either tacitly or explicitly encouraging cyber misbehavior for political purposes. But certainly that gave us a concrete example of how you might see cyber warfare as a complement to what we're used to with the physical domain and physical warfare. And the question is, what do we do about it, and why has it been difficult to come up with a comprehensive plan to address the problem? Now, I've alluded to some of this, which is so many of the assets and so many of the people involved are in the private sector. And so it's difficult to figure out where the government ought to interact and how the government ought to interact with the private sector. But I'd argue there are a couple of other challenging issues that have made it difficult. One is a tendency within the U.S. government itself to have a 20th century view of national security and how those national security responsibilities are allocated, so that people attack the problem of cybersecurity by looking at what they've traditionally had in their toolbox, and then they try to figure out how to make that work with respect to cyber threats. It's like the old saying, when you walk around with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the problem is we got hammers, we got screwdrivers, we have saws, and they can each deal with part of the problem, but they don't apply across the entire problem. A second challenge is that in the private sector, it is still difficult in the corporate world to get senior leadership to understand that an investment in cybersecurity is not just a cost, but it is intrinsic to protecting the very assets which are the foundation of a business. And turning that around and creating real incentives for the private sector, again, is a part of the challenge. A third, and in many ways, in my mind, the greatest obstacle to getting a real momentum behind cybersecurity is the fact that people view it as a technical problem, and therefore people who are not technical tend to shy away from it. Here's I think the very interesting perspective on cybersecurity. Although technical elements are certainly critical in cybersecurity, it is largely not a technical problem. It is a human problem. Experts say that if you look at some of the most serious cyber intrusions we've had over the years, it hasn't been because somebody found a vulnerability in a firewall and managed to exploit it, but it comes because of human failings, either inadvertent, negligent, or willful activity by human beings that actually allowed in malicious code or some malicious tools. Then I think we need to look at the allocation of responsibility between the public and private sector. And that's a debate we ought to have. There are some people, and there were people who proposed some time back, that this is really a government responsibility. And the government ought to basically treat the network as we treat the high seas and our waterways and ought to patrol the network. That has obvious consequences from a political and a freedom of speech standpoint, and I don't personally think that's a very good idea, but certainly that is a point of view. I've articulated the free market view, which is government stay out of it. I think that we will find as we debate it that the truth lies in the middle, that the more consequential the effect of an attack, the greater the role we may want the government to play. You know, if you mess up with your Netflix, it's not the end of the world. Probably the U.S. government doesn't have to be involved in that. But if you take down the financial system or the communication system and there's a loss of life, I think we do want to have the government at least playing a role there. This is a hard set of problems. I say a set of problems because it's not really one problem. And my experience in how people deal with hard problems or hard sets of problems is they often throw their hands up and sometimes they pretend the problem doesn't exist because it's easier to deal with it that way. But in fact, the right answer is to take the problems one step at a time. There is some low-hanging fruit in the cybersecurity world, and candidly, we're making some steps in addressing that. If you can reduce the risk 60, 70%, 80%, that's a big step forward. We should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If we can't solve everything, it doesn't mean we shouldn't solve some things. And so I think if we take that approach and we recognize it as perhaps the area of security where public-private partnership is most acutely necessary, I think we will work through this problem. And finally, let me say this. Will we ever eliminate the problem? No. Will there be anybody who can guarantee you there will not be cyber security intrusions and consequences? No. And if we could do it, it would be at an astronomical cost that would be not only financially backbreaking, but would also seriously impair the value of the internet itself. So it's about risk management.
Would you advocate, though, a specific requirement to notify law enforcement when you've had either a breach of your own network or an attempted breach that could be more systemic than your own system?
I think I would support something that over a certain, there are thousands and thousands of attacks every day on systems. You're not going to notify people about everything. I think over a threshold, I would support that kind of requirement, provided it was accompanied with protections of confidentiality, because obviously if people are not going to want to disclose if it's going to be used against them by their competitors. But if there were a way to perhaps anonymize it, make sure you're not compromising something that's personal or confidential, but convey the technical data, I think, above a certain threshold, I think there'd be some real value to that.
Is it the case, though, that at least at this point in time, the primary actors with the capability to launch a real threat are really state or state-sponsored actors? That whether it's extreme Islamic terrorists or other types of terrorist groups, at this point, don't have those types of capabilities? Or
I think if you ask people generally, they would view the state actor or state-sponsored actor. Now, sponsored is important because a lot of times a state may not explicitly control all the actors that are doing things on the internet, but they may facilitate. So I'm going to include that as part of the category of state sponsorship. I think it's probably still the case that the capabilities that are most sophisticated are nation states. But again, the startup costs for being a destructive force on the internet are not very high. And although terrorists have not typically been looking at this as an area because they've tended historically to look at the big boom with a big visual, that can change very quickly. So I mean, I would not underestimate the possibility of a terrorist group or criminal groups. You know, in addition, as I know many of you know, there are now criminal groups that don't actually execute the criminal activity per se. They simply provide the tools and service for rent. And so they're enablers, but they're not necessarily themselves out, you know, stealing the data that is the endpoint of the crime. That might very well also become a vector through which terrorists would operate.
There's legislation pending in the House that contemplates creating a national information sharing organization that would be overseen by a board that includes federal agencies, civil liberties organizations, and companies that own or operate critical infrastructure, utilities, financial institutions, and so forth. Do you favor this idea?
I favor, in general, information sharing. I am skeptical about new bureaucratic organizations as platforms for doing things. So I'd rather see an arrangement with existing structures to find a way to do this. Although I do think the principle of having the private sector involved in this process and the governance of the process is important. And we do have mechanisms for doing that. There are now a number of different kinds of organizations and bodies which are public-private partnerships that work together on a lot of these things. So I think, again, the principle is a good principle. I tend not to get out to endorse a particular piece of legislation. I'm always a little careful about new bureaucracies.
I would like to ask the audience to join me in thanking Mr. Chertoff for his excellent talk and discussion. Many thanks to the audience as well for your terrific questions and patience. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Thank you.